Hey guys, it's Natural Juan here. It's been a rough January for me, to be honest. Too much personal stuff happening in the background, and only a handful of them can be called good. In any case, here I am again to tell you yet another story regarding the night hag. This is a story from someone I actually know in real life, and, as such, I treat it with as much neutrality as possible. I tend to think of myself as a skeptic and am easily put off by stories of the supernatural, especially if its aims are to convince people to work against their best interests. However, with this shared story, I find myself wondering whether or not the supernatural aspect of it might be true. After all, being somewhat of a religious person myself, I have to believe in the supernatural as well. Anyway, please lay back as I read to you this story sent to me by a friend who would prefer that his name not be said. All I am allowed to tell you is that he is a security guard that I know in real life who has a family of his own. This story is translated whole cloth from my friend's private message, which was written in Filipino or Tagalog. Anyway, before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit that bell for notifications if you would like to see more content like this. Also, quick shout out to Mr. Jonathan Green, my patron in Patreon. If you would also like to support my channel and what I do here, you can check my Patreon, PayPal, and Gcash information in the description below. Alright now, let's begin. Dear Natural Juan, I sent to you this message so that you can read it out on your YouTube channel. I was actually planning to send this story out to other horror channels on YouTube, but I know you personally, and you have a global reach. You are also well versed in English, unlike a lot of us, and I think that foreigners out there should either hear this story so they can learn a bit from it, or maybe they've had similar experiences of their own and want to share them. Anyway, this took place in the monsoon season of 2021. As you know, I got quite a big family, and my earnings aren't exactly sizable, if you know what I mean. It's especially hard now with the way the prices of basic goods are going up and security guards don't really make a lot. Before this happened, I didn't really believe in the supernatural, if that's what it really was. Even as I write this, I find myself questioning a lot about it. You've talked to me about this thing called sleep paralysis and how it might just be some fancy electronics in our brains that sometimes causes us to see things that aren't real or aren't really significant at all. Based on what you've told me, which you say has a basis in science, the weird hallucinations are nothing more than random stuff that our senses, like our sight, hearing, and touch, can pick up on. I'll say that I believe most of that, since I've had numerous dreams that people say are signs of bad luck, but nothing bad has ever happened to me that wasn't a result of human stupidity or random chance. But then all that changed when I bought a certain second-hand blanket. Being a security guard, I don't really make all that much, but my kids are big on stuff like Disney and Marvel Comics. I know you aren't a parent, but even you can probably understand that every mom and dad wants to get something nice for their kids when they can. When their kids want chocolate, you do your best to get them one of those fancy foreign stuff like them Kisses thingies or Toblerone bars that can probably double as weapons. When their sons want to get the latest gadget, or maybe a t-shirt with some NBA player on it, you save up to get them what they want. And when their daughters want to go out with that local boy down the street, that's a different story, as you well know. Anyways, while I was with my wife looking to buy clothes for our kids at a second-hand store, something caught my eye. It was a blue blanket with that white-haired girl from that computer-made movie from Disney. The one with that memorable song in it that just about every kid from around the world was singing when the movie came out. Of course, for a grumpy adult like me, sing a song often enough and it becomes annoying. And yeah, I'm equally annoyed by that Jopay song that every Filipino youngster seems to be singing about lately. I'm going off topic again, so I'll just get right back to the point, where my wife and I bought the blanket at an astoundingly cheap price. My wife even asked the sales lady why it was so cheap, even though it seems to not just be original, but also in really good shape. The sales lady said that the blanket had been sold twice already, only for the people who bought it to return it immediately the next day. Both times she offered a refund, but the second buyer didn't stay long enough to get their money, which made me a little suspicious. I asked the sales lady where they got the blanket, and she told me that it was an item that was washed up after the big storm, and no one really knew where it came from. After it was thoroughly washed and the splotches of mud scrubbed out of the fabric, they deemed it good enough to be sold again. I wanted to ask more, but, of course, I knew that my daughter would really love this blanket, and this deal the sales lady was offering was just too good to be true. So we bought the blanket, and the rest was history. God, you should have seen my daughter's face when she saw the blanket for the first time. It was like her eyes would pop out of her head, and the smile on her face threatened to split the rest of her head from ear to ear. Being a dad and all, I couldn't help but feel happy for my daughter at the time. Nothing much happened during our first week with the blanket, but maybe my daughter and my younger son, who shared a room with her, probably kept much of what happened to themselves. It wouldn't be until one Tuesday night that things would take a turn for the strange, and not in a good way. On that particular night, my son didn't want to sleep in the same room with his sister. Of course, I asked why, and all he said was that there was a lady in their room that scared him. I laughed and told him he was too old to be scared of ghosts. Besides, I joked, it was probably just his late grandmother who passed away a few years back. The grandmother in question was actually my mother-in-law, who, I must admit, was one of the better people I knew. She was a good woman, and if it was her ghost hanging around watching my kids, I wouldn't mind at all. But then my son said that the woman he saw was scary, and when I asked him to describe the woman, this was how he described her. The old woman wore all black, and you could only see her pale, scary face in the moonlight. Her hair was black and messy, and her eyes were yellow like a cat's. My son told me that she had sharp yellow teeth instead of normal human teeth, and long black claws for fingernails. At the time, I only laughed it off and told my son to man up. This would be a decision I would later come to regret. I wish I took the boy a little more seriously at that time. The first really bad incident came one night when my son came running into our room shouting that an old woman was in their room strangling his sister. I got up immediately, grabbed a flashlight, and charged right into their room. I was expecting a burglar or something to have broken into our house, but instead I find my daughter struggling against the blue blanket I had just bought, which had wrapped around her neck. My wife and I rushed in and tried to wake my daughter up, who had gone unconscious, while I took off the blanket that was wrapped around her neck. What I found strangest of all was how tight the blanket had wrapped around my daughter's neck. Did she do that while sleeping? It was possible. Could her brother have done that? Very unlikely, especially considering what would happen next. The next incident would take place on a Friday of the same week as before. Now, before I go on, there are things that I need to make clear first. My children's beds are far apart. You would need to walk a couple of steps before you could go from one to the other. The blanket in question was both large and heavy and couldn't just be easily blown about by a strong wind unless it was from a storm. For another, my son is a boy's boy. He hates girly stuff like what his sister likes and would never want to use or borrow any of her stuff. Lastly, and this is what chills me to the bone when I remember it, my daughter had her blue blanket neatly folded and placed near the head of her bed. That night, I woke to the sound of my daughter screaming and, like a fool, ran straight to my children's room. This time, I saw that the blanket had found its way to my son's bed and was now wrapped tightly around his neck. My daughter was tugging desperately at the blanket as if trying to fight it off, like if it was alive or something. She seemed like she was still partly asleep. My wife ran through the doorway beside me and proceeded to wake my daughter up and unwrap the blanket around my son's neck. My son was still conscious when we removed the blanket, but it was obvious that both he and his sister were terrified. To make matters worse, there was now something else too. Both my children bore scratch marks on them as if someone with long fingernails had clawed at them. When we asked the kids what happened, my son said that the old woman he described to me last time moved from his sister's bed to his own in one quick leap and started choking him. He said he tried to fight back, but the woman easily overpowered him, My daughter then woke up and saw the old woman attacking her brother and went to his bed to help, but the monstrous hag clawed at her to keep her off. It was then that both my wife and I decided that this was something else. I mean, it was possible the scratch marks my kids had were something they gave each other or themselves. However, on both occasions, the incident had something to do with my daughter's new blanket. I asked my daughter if she wanted to keep the blanket, but she gave us a hard shake of her head. She said that the blanket wasn't just the thing that strangled them in their sleep. She said that it was the old woman, or night hag as you so put it. It would take on its horrendous form while both she and her brother were almost asleep and the lights were off, but would then revert back into a wholesome-looking blanket whenever my wife and I entered the room and turned on the lights. And that made it clear that she didn't want the blanket anywhere around herself or her brother at night. Needless to say, my wife and I agreed to just take the blanket into our room and return it to the store the next day and maybe ask for a refund. We took the blanket to our own room, and I specifically remember stuffing it into a cabinet near the foot of our bed. We then saw that it was only around 11:30 and had quite a while yet before morning would come, so we decided to sleep it off for the time being. That was another big mistake that we made. I woke up suddenly in the early hours of the morning and turned to see that a horrible old woman was on my bed strangling my wife with her thin, pale hands that ended in black, claw-like fingernails. I will never forget the awful face of that old woman with her yellow eyes and frightening sharp teeth. She had messy black hair that draped over my wife's choking form, and the old woman only cackled when she saw that I was looking at her. I tried to grab at the hag and get her off my wife, but she was insanely strong. I tried to punch her while avoiding hitting my wife, who was already fighting for her life as the hag slowly strangled the life out of her. I shouted at the woman and told my wife to hold on as I tried to fight off the hag. It was probably just a few seconds, but for me and my wife, it felt like we had been struggling for hours. It was only when I called out to the Lord's name that things started to turn in my favor. Of course, as I struggled with the hag, I began to lose hope and thought that my wife would die. But then the lights in my room turned on, and the old woman became the blue blanket again. I turned to see that my kids had woken up and heard me shouting loudly into the night. They said that the things I shouted were not things they heard from me often and decided to investigate. As they peeked in, I would later remind myself to keep the door locked when my wife and I wanted some private time together. They saw the hag strangling their mother and rushed in to help. Just like it was with them, it seemed that turning on the light somehow took the power from the night hag and forced her into becoming just a blanket again. Without any discussions or second thoughts, I took the blanket, took it outside, poured gas on the thing, and set it on fire. I don't know whether that was the right thing to do or not, but it was all I could think of at the time. As the blanket burned into the darkness before the dawn, I thought I heard a distant shrieking, but even that I could chalk up to local birds being scared out of their minds at the sudden fire. Still, I would rule out the possibility that the night hag was indeed real, and that it had nearly killed the people I loved. Was what I did right? In my mind at the time, I would say yes. Although I am kinda worried that I should have spoken to a priest or a local mystic first. It worries me that maybe, by burning the thing, instead of defeating or destroying the night hag in the cursed blanket, I might have let it loose in the world. Still, I'd like to think that might just be me overthinking, and that the night hag was gone for good. As for the refund, I don't think it was worth the trouble. Anyway, thanks a lot, Juan, if you decide to read my story out to people out there. Well guys, this story was rather scary. Now I've heard of things like the cursed blanket you have there, and I do think it would have been best if our sender just handed it over to a priest or any kind of religious minister. Perhaps maybe blessing it with holy water first before setting on fire would have kept the thing in it from becoming free, if that was indeed what happened. In any case, dear sender, I do hope that you and your family are okay now, and that whatever entity dwelled in the cursed blanket, it is now gone for good. Natural Juan